Hello, everyone. I am Ben Johnson, and this is the Perpetual Chess Podcast. Perpetual Chess is a weekly chess interview show where we talk with accomplished chess players, authors, and personalities about their lives, their careers, and how to improve at chess. Perpetual Chess is brought to you through the generosity of its Patreon and PayPal supporters and by Chessable.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to Perpetual Chess, Chess Books Recaptured. We are here this month to discuss one of my favorite authors, one of our guest co-hosts' favorite authors. Genna Sosonko is the author, and the guest goes by the name of Vjeko Nemec. He's a longtime friend of the pod. He has a website called Chess Essentials. He does some work for Chessables. He has a course for Chessable called the Winning with the Modern, I believe. He can correct me in a minute, but has a great blog where he writes about a lot of chess books, and now he is going to hop in and join us. Vjeko, how are you?
Oh, thank you, Ben, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really, really excited to be here. I just have two little corrections. It's not winning with the modern or something like that, because no one sane would ever call his course winning with the modern, like maybe suffering with the modern. And
right.
it would be
suffering less.
Yeah. And the second correction is it's not chess essentials, it's kind of chess essentials, kind of the funny stuff. Although, many people confuse it. That was me trying to be fun.
Got you. Yeah, Vjeko, you're good. You're quite an impressive English writer and speaker that you're able to do the puns in English. And I apologize. I know I've made that mistake before, so so I apologize for doing it again. It's a Chess Essentials, and yeah. So we're here to talk Genna Sosonko, who wrote the he's written so many excellent books. He's been on the show. So listeners, if you haven't already, you should go back and listen. It was in June of 2018, episode 80. He's a legendary author, Grandmaster, who grew up in the Soviet Union and made his way to the Netherlands, and now he writes these one-of-a-kind books. So Vjeko was the one who volunteered to pick a Sosonko book. So Vjeko, what was your thought process behind kindly volunteering to help us recap a Genna Sosonko book?
Well, there was not much of a thought process, actually. I mean, when I saw that you are launching this book podcast, it was immediately my idea to recommend one of my favorite authors, Genna Sosonko. So it was really a no-brainer. I have to say that I did try to recommend a different book, but then we kind of diverged to the one at hand, the World Champions I knew. Go on.
Sorry, I feel like I should hop in and explain myself. So yeah, Sosonko has written 6 books in English to date. And yeah, this is probably not his best book. I think we both agree. But the reason I kind of, once Vjeko volunteered to do a Sosonko book, I kind of gently prodded him to do this one, I guess you could say, just because I feel like this one is the most accessible, even if it's not the best, because it's about world champions. And Vjeko can tell you briefly a little bit more about his other works. But the other ones are well, there's a few. Vjeko, why don't you tell us a bit about his other works?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go full elitist here, but Ben, I think, made the same thing, because for somebody who is maybe not so familiar or not such a huge fan of the chess history, maybe this book about the world champions is slightly more accessible than the other books. But it has to be pointed out that Sosonko made a living writing about Soviet chess, Soviet era, and Soviet chess players. And the reason I'm really fond of his style is that he digs stories about these half-forgotten chess masters like Genrikh Chepukaitis or Ratmir Komov, and then puts them into the context of the Soviet times. He writes a lot about the Soviet hierarchy, the politics, and behind the scenes. And he also has a very personal style, because he writes about grandmasters he knew himself, as we will probably discuss in this book.
Well said, Vjeko. I agree that his writing is just so evocative. That's the one thing that strikes me about it. I mean, when he's having dialogue with these champions, I mean, he quotes them, and it's like he quotes them talking to him. So there'll be like, Smyslov saying like, "Genna, meet me for breakfast at 5," or, or whatever it might be. And you just really feel like you're there. So, and personally, I have to admit, I've only read his last 3 books. That his first 3, which are some of the ones you mentioned, Smart Chip from St. Petersburg, and help me out with the other titles, Vjeko.
There are Russian Silhouettes and Reliable Past. I think these 3 are mainly about the Soviet times and Soviet chess players. He did write some, let's say, biographies on a single player, most notably on Viktor Korchnoi. I kind of forgot the title right now. And he also has a separate book about Vasily Smyslov and one very painful, I would say, about David Bronstein. And yeah, I agree. It's very, very, very nice how he writes about these players. He quotes them directly. He writes about the phone conversations with them or actual conversations he had with them in the person. And he doesn't really filter or edit anything. He kind of writes their words down as they said them. And you really get the feeling that through his conversations, you kind of get to know these players as well, I would say.
Yeah, and when he was on the show, of course, we talked about his Bronstein book a lot, which was fairly recent at the time. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to dig into. I certainly intend to read his full catalog, and just based on how he writes and based on Vjeko's recommendation, I would, I feel very safe endorsing them. But I did feel like this was the best intro, and then for listeners who end up either just having their interest piqued or reading this and wanting to read more, you can then go back and read his that are kind of like the deeper cuts that are really take you into the Soviet chess era. But so this one is about the 7 world champions that he knew, although he didn't quite know them all, we have to say.
Yes. So he writes about the lineage starting from Capablanca all the way to Petrosian, I believe. So these are 7 consecutive world champions. And obviously he didn't personally know Capablanca nor Alekhine, which about whom he also writes in the first 2 chapters. So it was kind of filler or or a lie in the title of the book. But yeah, the majority of them he knew personally quite well.
Yeah, so it's Alekhine, Capablanca, Euwe, Botvinnik, Smyslov, Tal, and Petrosian are the 7 authors he discusses. And yeah, filler is a good way to put it, unfortunately. I mean, I love Sosonko, but if you're listening, I mean, we just have to call a spade a spade. You know, it's it's not a super long book. And he had very personal, extremely evocative experiences with some of these world champions that make the book highly worthwhile, but not with all of the ones that are covered. And we'll be digging into that more as we go on. One other thing we should say is this is a book with 0 actual chess in it. We even have a quote about that we'll get to that eventually. But we're not even going to pretend and talk about famous games, you know, that may have been mentioned offhand in the book. I mean, this one is straight prose, straight sort of oral history. And that's what we'll be doing on this month. And then for next month's Chess Books Recaptured, we'll be getting back to something with some actual chess in it. So, Vjeko, do you want to share a little bit more about Sosonko's biography, just for anyone who may not be as familiar with him?
Well, yeah. So Sosonko was originally obviously born in the Soviet Union, and I think back in the day he reached the title of international master, or maybe not even then, or maybe he was just a master. Now I'm not sure from the top of my head.
I think he made it right when he emigrated to Holland. I think he emigrated to Holland, I believe, in 1972, and I think he made IM a couple years later.
Yeah, and ultimately he made the Grandmaster. Although that just maybe shows how strong these Soviet players who didn't get the opportunity to play a lot in foreign tournaments were, because Sosonko, I mean, I think he worked as a second to many of these players who were actually mentioned in the book and analyzed with them. And so immediately after he leaves the Soviet Union, he becomes an international master. So I think it's quite a fit.
Yeah, I mean, he was a chess professional. In fact, in the section about Max Euwe, he mentions that Euwe, who was, of course, a world champion, but also later the president of FIDE, he made a conscious push to sort of expand the number of grandmasters in the world. So at the time that Sosonko was trying to earn his titles, there were probably fewer than 100 grandmasters in the world, certainly a lot less than the 1,600 or so that exist now. So it was just a different thing. And as you say, the titles themselves were more challenging to earn. So, but he was certainly, you know, he was someone in the top echelon of chess players, even if he wasn't exactly a world champion contender himself, he certainly moved around in those circles.
Yeah, and he also later become very famous, obviously, because of his defection to the West. So he emigrated from the Soviet Union via Israel, I believe, to Netherlands. And, he was kind of precedent for the much more famous emigration from the Soviet Union that happened 4 years later. That is, of course, the emigration of Viktor Korchnoi. And actually, he played a very major role in Korchnoi's decision to emigrate as well, because he obviously had the experience, and Korchnoi, just very briefly before he emigrated, he actually talked with both Sosonko and Euwe about the potential consequences and whether he should do it or not. So yeah, kind of historic figure in chess history, as well as obviously very strong player, I would say.
Yeah, and of course we're just so lucky that he's also an amazing writer. I mean, there's tons of there's been tons of chess players of his caliber. Even though he's an amazing player, there's hundreds of people who were on his level over the years, but there's no one that can write like him and can share these experiences like him. So I mean, he's quite accomplished. Won the Dutch championship in 1973 and 1978 jointly. Won a bunch of other tournaments, played for the Dutch team in the Olympiad 11 times, but I would say his greatest contribution is as a writer.
Yeah, I think that it's not only about the fact that he was qualified to write about these topics, because he obviously lived on both sides of the Iron Curtain, but it's kind of, he's very, very talented as a writer. As we will see, I think later, there are many, many memorable quotes, and he writes very beautifully, poetically almost, and also his erudition and general knowledge of literature, of music, of just general culture, is a number of references he puts into his books is astounding, to be honest. And it's really very, very beautiful to read his books, even though it has to be pointed out that they are by no means a tool for chess improvement. So
yeah, not at all chess improvement related, but yeah, great pleasure to listen. Unfortunately, I don't think that they're an audiobook. If anyone's wondering about that, that would be a great way to, get some chess history on the go. But definitely great couch reading, and will enrich your appreciation of chess. And as Vjeko says, you get some great quotes from outside of chess, because he's good at drawing in other fields. And of course, you get great historical perspective, especially just for, what it must have been like to live in the Soviet era. So the book is from New in Chess Publishing, published in 2013. And the foreword is by none other than Garry Kasparov, who wrote a really glowing foreword. And this, just to give you a little taste, Kasparov said, "This new book by a wonderful man of letters, Genna Sosonko, is dedicated to the world chess champions, a former Soviet chess master and trainer who once assisted Tal and Korchnoi, and now a famous international grandmaster who's been living in the West for 40 years already. Sosonko doesn't know the champions by hearsay. He met most of them more than once, and not only at the chessboard." So that kind of sets the scene for the book. So I think we should dig in. What do you think, Vjeko?
Yeah, that sounds good. I think we have introduced Sosonko a lot. So
yeah, and we should mention we both read the book on Kindle. It's pretty inexpensive on Kindle and great for highlighting the many memorable quotes. So we're going to dig into the book and kick off by reading the first page. But first, we're going to take a quick break to hear from both of our friends at Chessable. Hello there, listeners. I wanted to call your attention this week to 2 courses from Chessable.com. Number 1, The Modern Defense Against Everything by our guest co-host Vjekoslav Nemec. It's pretty new. It came out in February. Vjeko's got a 2600 Chess.com Blitz rating, as we talk about on this show, and he attributes a lot of his success to his quickness with knowing this opening. So go to Chessable.com and have a look. The other thing is I wanted to call your attention to former U.S. champion Sam Shankland's brand new course, Lifetime Repertoires, Black versus the English, Reti, and Sidelines. I personally find these openings super boring to play against, so it would be nice to actually know what I'm doing and learn from renowned theoretician Sam Shankland. So go to Chessable.com and have a look at these courses. Okay, and we're back, and we are ready to dig into this excellent book. And of course, we like to kick things off just by reading some from the first page of the book, the thing that sort of is most emblematic of the tone of the book. And for this one, I felt like I kind of had to do a big excerpt. So I'm going to read right how the book kicks off, right after Kasparov's preface. And here we go. These are the words of Genna Sosonko. He says, "Life has given me the gift of meetings with many world champions. Their achievements in games are known to everyone, so there are no diagrams in the book that you hold in your hands. Guided by the advice of Henri Kine, who once wrote, 'There is nothing more boring on this earth than to have to read the description of an Italian journey, except maybe to have to write one. And the writer can only make it halfway bearable by speaking as little as possible of Italy itself. I'll say as little as possible about chess itself. Most people's perceptions are limited by a single culture, while an emigre is familiar with at least two. This kind of outlook broadens your worldview, allowing you to look at events, people, and countries from various perspectives, especially as happened in my case, when the difference between two cultures and lifestyles is gigantic. My desk is positioned a considerable distance away from the country where I was born and where I spent the first 3 decades of my life. It is the same one that has served as my faithful and true chess table, which is perhaps why the black and white squares of the chessboard permeate everything I write about." Okay, and off he goes from there, and it really gives you a sense for his great writing style. And of course, I can relate to the quote about talking as little about the actual chess as possible, because that's basically what I endeavor to do on this podcast, being that it's an audio only podcast about a board game. That's right up my alley for sure.
Yeah. I think that this introductory passage already captures the features of Sosonko writing style. Like, I mean, just the use of the words like gigantic, permeate. I don't know. It's really beautiful and top-notch writing, I would say, in its own regard.
Yeah. And within those first few pages, he goes on to have a few more sort of shorter evocative quotes, such as he says when he wants to write about the world champions, he wanted to share the things that they themselves didn't notice. And he also says, getting back to what we were saying about why we like him so much, under the mask of a chess player, I always remained a storyteller.
Yeah, I think the quote about sharing the things that the players themselves didn't notice is particularly important, or the reason why I like Sosonko, or another reason why I like Sosonko's book so much, because he doesn't shy away from talking about difficult topics and difficult aspects of the chess player's character. So usually when you read these biographies by great players, I mean, they are kind of biased in their favor, I would say, but he doesn't shy away from showing both sides of the medal, which will be especially apparent in the chapter about Tal, I believe.
Yeah, the chapter about Tal, and certainly anyone who's read his biography of Bronstein, that one is very informative, and I enjoyed it overall, but it can be painful to read at times.
Yeah, I think that John Hartman did a fantastic review of that book on his chess book reviews, and he really captured how I've personally felt in his reviews. So it's really like gives you mixed feelings of kind of relating to some stuff or the pain, and also like just not being at ease with some traits of Bronstein's character, I would say. But that's maybe now digressing from the topic at hand.
Yeah, but shout out to John Hartman. I enjoyed his review as well, as we always do. So let's get to the champions. I mean, without further ado. So Vjeko and I decided that the way we would do this, rather than just take it in a strictly linear discussion of the chapters in the order that they're written, we would rank the chapters. Both of us, we had similar tastes in what our favorite chapters are, but one thing we'll say is we're going to save the best for last, so please stick with us. I mean, there's insights about all of the players, but as we'll say, as we've already hinted, it's a pretty uneven book in both of our opinions. There's a lot more insight in the people that he knows personally. So without further ado, Vjeko, what was your least favorite chapter in the World Champions I Knew?
Yeah, so my least favorite chapter of the book was actually the very first chapter of the book, and that is the chapter about Jose Raul Capablanca, which, as we mentioned, Sosonko obviously didn't know, because if I'm not mistaken, Sosonko was born 1 year after Capablanca died.
I think he said that.
Yeah, I think it is stated somewhere. And the reason why I'm not fond of this chapter is because it is so I should probably explain that this chapter is written on the basis of conversations Sosonko had with Capablanca's widow, Olga, which were conducted in her apartment in New York. So he didn't personally know Capablanca, and her account about the Cuban is pretty one-sided. So we have just discussed how Sosonko usually aims to provide both sides of the medal, and this chapter is both devoid of his personal impressions of Capablanca because he listens to them secondhand, and also Capablanca's widow accounts a very biased account on Capablanca being like this brilliant genius who was, effortlessly good at chess and basically everything else he touched. And that kind of gets boring after a while, I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely a glowing portrait of her, of Capablanca by his wife. But I mean, I would just like to say, if my wife ever gets interviewed, I would like for her to give such a glowing portrait as well. So,
yeah, this may be a bit dark, but when you're alive or after you die.
I'll take it. If she's going to talk about me that way, just, it doesn't matter to me.
Okay.
But yeah, so for me, it was my second least favorite. I liked it far better than the Alekhine chapter, as we'll get to, because I think your criticisms are valid. But a couple things I would say is, number one, I mean, Capablanca really was a bad MF. I mean, he really was amazing at a lot of things and once in a lifetime talent. So I understand why she would speak of him in such glowing terms. But the other thing is just, I at least felt like this chapter had a narrative. I mean, he tells the story of going to New York and meeting her and being received by her and then seeing her on subsequent visits. So I understand that it's not the same as him knowing the champion and it's not a totally balanced portrait, but I at least learned things that I felt like it's a firsthand account similar to his other work. As opposed to the Alekhine one, which we'll get to. So that's where I stand. But I do think, sorry, you can hop in, Vjeko, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may just interject, I wanted to say that obviously my account is very subjective and it may have something to do with the fact that in the eternal debate, Capablanca versus Alekhine, I'm firmly in the Alekhine's camp.
You're team Alekhine, huh?
Yeah, totally. So
okay, yeah, I'm in the tank for Capablanca. So yeah, that might have something to do with it.
Yeah, definitely.
And just for any listeners not aware of Capablanca, first of all, you should definitely make yourselves aware. But he was the third world champion, and certainly in the handful of people that gets listed in the top 5 to 10 players of all times. Very natural and intuitive chess player. So his wife was named Olga. She was actually Soviet by birth. And we're only going to share a few quotes again about these chapters that we didn't like as much, but they definitely back up what Vjeko was saying about how glowing it was. Here's one from Olga. She says, "You must understand he was a king and in every way conducted himself like a king. When someone before a simul asked for him to be pointed out, they said, when they enter the hall, you will see yourself who is Capablanca."
Yeah, if I may also add another one, Sosonko actually kind of agrees with my viewpoint, or I should say I agree with his viewpoint, because even he points out that this perfection can get boring. There is an instance in the chapter where he returns back to New York and then writes how he decided against visiting her another time because, if I may quote, Olga talked about Capablanca as something perfect, and perfection has only one defect: it can become tedious.
Yeah.
So I know that Capablanca was an outstanding individual, but I kind of find it hard to believe that he was so perfect as everybody tries to describe him. And I would have liked to kind of unravel at least one flaw or duality of his character in a maybe more balanced account. But okay.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, she says he barely studied chess, which in itself is hard to believe. I mean, she did know him sort of past his pinnacle, but it's hard to believe someone of that caliber would not look at chess that much. And she talks about how he could have been world class at music, great at billiards, table tennis. Of course, he played baseball in college. So yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying. And of course, Capablanca does have a reputation that women loved him, and she discusses that. He met her at a party, and apparently, according to Edward Winter, who quoted a long article that she herself wrote, that Olga Capablanca Clark herself wrote, where when they met at this party, Capablanca said, "Someday you and I will be married." So, really, Yeah, exactly.
That's a smooth pickup line.
Exactly.
I should try that once.
Yeah,
maybe.
I don't know if you could use it every time, Vjeko, but definitely on special occasions.
And also, perhaps I just wanted to mention that Edward Winter is the famous chess historian who is very meticulous about chess history. So usually when he writes something about anybody, basically you can rely that it's true or reliable or researched at the very least.
Yes, yes, well said. So anything else from Capablanca before we move on?
Well, maybe just the fact that I found very interesting that she said that he basically never played Blitz for pleasure.
Right.
Which is also maybe debatable, or hard to believe, at least for me.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and she said that he was reading all the time, but not about chess. Again, might be true, but certainly would be unusual for a world champion.
Yeah, but the very fact that we are asking ourselves whether something is true is already like a minus for this chapter in my eyes. So
yeah, I mean, you would hope that one's wife would be a somewhat reliable source, but yeah, I mean, it's just hard to know. And of course, sometimes you not intentionally just, I think Sosonko himself says at some point that, when someone passes away, kind of often like the bad memories will fade and the good memories will kind of rise to the top. So there could be some of that element where she's not intentionally just painting this glowing picture of him, but that's legitimately how she remembers him once he's no longer around.
Yeah.
So Olga lived to be 95, and as Vjeko mentioned, Sosonko did not see her in his last visit to New York before she passed away, but that does give you a little flavor of what that chapter's like. And we should move on to your second least favorite chapter, Vjeko.
And your first least favorite, and that's the chapter about Alekhine.
Yeah.
Or Alekhine.
Yeah.
How is he pronounced? I'm never sure.
Yeah, I just switch back and forth so that no one's happy.
Yeah.
But of course, Alekhine, fourth world champion, held the title for a total of 17 years and unequivocally one of the strongest players ever. So, of course, and, an interesting character, not universally admired away from the board, to say the least.
Yeah, very controversial and very peculiar in a sense that his fate, so to speak, was heavily influenced by both world wars. So both in the World War I and World War II, he had, let's say, issues with authorities. In the World War I with the Soviet ones, and in the World War II with Nazi Germany.
Yeah, yeah, quite a rich life, and both in and out of chess. What was it? What are your, I mean, I don't want to just go straight to complaints, but I guess I would say, what is your overall take on this chapter, Vjeko?
Shouldn't you be the one who complains about this one?
Okay,
With favorite,
yeah.
I can just fill in what you missed, maybe.
Okay, I mean, for me, what it was, and again, Genna Sosonko, if you're listening, we do love you. We're going to make up for this when we talk about the later chapters, but I just felt like it was kind of a random assortment of observations with no real through line. There was no like driving narrative. That's why I was saying I liked it even less than the Capablanca chapter, because at least that was one person's story, whereas this was just sort of like a collection of observations. Vjeko mentioned that it might be filler. I mean, we do need to compile a book, and I did just sort of feel like there wasn't anything that original about Alekhine. I mean, of course, Sosonko, I'm sure in many instances was one degree of separation from him, but I still didn't feel like it was woven into a comprehensive narrative. I mean, he did talk about some personalities traits and stuff, but when he talks about the later champions, the ones that he lived alongside, you really feel like you're there, and obviously that's not going to be the case with the Alekhine chapter.
Yeah, I agree that this is somewhat incoherent, and actually it might have something to do. Now I'm not sure, but I read one Amazon review of the book, and it mentioned that it complained about the lack of coherence all throughout the book, and he mentioned that the reason for that is because all these stories or parts of these stories and chapters were already featured in other publications. So maybe this one, is like a collection of several articles, and hence the feeling of incoherence.
Yeah, because like, for example, with the Petrosian chapters, it's it's the first 6 chapters are 6 world champions in 6 chapters, even though they're very different in length. But then Petrosian, there's just kind of 3 different chapters about him, which would definitely fit in with a theory of these were 3 essays that were just kind of all plopped in there.
Yeah, so okay, I don't have much to add to these complaints, although I do have one big complaint of my own, and that is, I mean, the incoherence bothered me to an extent, but what bothered me even more was the lack of any sort of citations and quotes or references for all the stories and claims from that chapter. So there are stories about Alekhine being in masonry, then the never-ending story about him drinking. Then there is also controversy about him being murdered on deathbed, and all those stories are kind of more like rumors, or like they're not confirmed by evidence. And Sosonko doesn't, as far as I know, provide any references for this chapter. And actually, there is a great article by Winter, which we mentioned earlier, about the importance of starting to include references into chess history in general, because else it comes down to banalities and entertaining fun stories. And he points out that only with including references and citations we start to take chess history more seriously. And I think that this aspect is particularly important when it comes to Alekhine, who had, as I have said, such a rich and controversial story intertwined with 2 world wars. So a lot of there to take into account, I would say.
Yeah, and generally Sosonko's writing style doesn't necessarily lend itself to references when he's doing personal recollections, but because Alekhine was before his time, it's not really personal recollection. So I agree. It's not the best source. I mean, and there's no part of the book where I was like really suffering when I was reading it, but definitely these are the weaker parts of the book.
Yeah, we are maybe too negative on conveying the wrong impression. I mean, it's still fun to read, but in contrast to other chapters or some other books, it's kind of you can feel the difference. It's precisely because Sosonko didn't know these 2 players, and I think he's best when he wrote on personal account, where precisely these sorts of references are not the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, and I mean, after all, the book is called "The World Champions I Knew." So,
yeah.
Okay, so who was your third? What was your third least chapter? And this is where it gets interesting, because now we're to the point where he really did know the 5 remaining champions.
Yeah, this is where we really start diverging in our opinion, I would say.
Yeah.
So my least favorite chapter was the chapter about Smyslov. So he after Capablanca and Alekhine, he writes chronologically about Euwe, Botvinnik, and then Smyslov, and the Smyslov one was my least favorite.
Yeah, I liked the Smyslov one. I mean, I think we both liked it. I think we're kind of splitting hairs once we get. I mean, I feel like we both thought the Tal one was the best, and the first 2 were the worst, and then the ones 3 through 6, I think, are in between.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's the weakest of the remaining 5. It's not by any means bad. My problem with the Smyslov was that I have read previously his book Smyslov on the Couch, which is like a very broad account on the Smyslov, and kind of many things that are present in this chapter were familiar to me from that book, and that was especially true on the second reading. So we did reread the book before this episode.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm gonna hop in and read a quote, and we'll be doing a lot more quotes from here on out, but just because, like Vjeko mentioned earlier, there's so much good stuff. So he just jumps right in to the chapter and talks about Smyslov offering to meet him for breakfast at Tilburg, 1992. So he says, I knew you'd come, Genna. Sit down. I haven't slept since 5. I was tormented at first. What made an old idiot like me play the Pearson the last game? And then I started thinking about my age, and it just seemed unreal. How can I be 71 years old? How can this be possible? Then I remembered going on holiday to Sevastopol with my father and mother. It was like yesterday, but in fact, it was the summer of 1928. You wouldn't believe it, Genna. But since then, I've never been to the Crimea again. I've been to Argentina, Iceland, the Philippines. I've been everywhere except to the Crimea. And then I started going over my life. If Mother Volga could flow back and then, if we could start to live our lives again. So very stark contrast to the chapters we were just discussing. Very personal, and I just love the way. I mean, I don't know what his style was. I don't know if he was taking notes or writing it down like that night. But these quotes throughout the rest of the book are all so personal and so evocative.
I think that I'm not 100% sure whether he did it for all the champions, but I think that at some point he started carrying a recorder with him and recording these conversations. I do recall. I have read in one of his books that one of the persons he writes about at some point asked him, "Oh, are you going to write a book about me?" Because he saw this recorder. So I think that it's all word to word, and that's. I think he was typing the quotes as he was hearing them, and then we really get the feeling that the person was saying.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Bronstein or Korchnoi, but I remember that as well. They're saying, "Are you going to put that in the book?"
Yeah. I'm not even sure either, but I know it was a thing. Yeah.
But I understand why. So Smyslov, you had a few quibbles about it. To be fair, so I mean, he was a unique personality. Could you tell us? So first of all, he was the 7th world champion. What else do we need to know more generally about Smyslov, Vjeko?
Well, he was known for his harmonious, very positional style, I would say, and he played 3 matches against Botvinnik in the 50s. And he was known to be like a chess evergreen because he was one of the rare persons who kept playing at a very high level at a very advanced age. So if I'm not mistaken, he played the World Championship Candidates Final in 1983, which was 26 years after he won the World Championship crown, which is a respectable feat.
Yeah.
And he held many records for the biggest age gap. I don't know, he played some Clash of Generations matches in the 90s. So he was really, really active well into his old age, I would say.
Yeah, Smyslov and Korchnoi, the consummate adult improvers, or at least not get worsers.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I don't know. So this was my impression of Smyslov before I read this book and the other book. So I always kind of had the feeling that he was sort of a good guy of Soviet chess. So the least controversial figure in comparison to other players, not very combative, not very susceptible to mischiefs and egoistic, so to speak. But this chapter kind of provided me with some glimpses that it may not all be true. That he was also very pragmatic and careful about what he would say in public. So it has to be said that throughout this book and throughout other Sosonko's books, you can always feel this invisible hand of the authorities reigning of the players' hands, because being a Soviet grandmaster in that time was a privilege that came with the possibilities to travel abroad and to experience life fully. But one wrong action could result in those privileges being revoked, and everybody was very, very careful and vigilant not to lose those privileges. And Smyslov was not an exception, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always dominating the sort of narrative of what he's writing about, but it's always there. And like for, spoiled modern democracy residents like ourselves, it's easy to lose sight of. But I mean, he talks about like giving both Smyslov and Tal the Gulag Archipelago, the famous anti-Soviet book by Solzhenitsyn when it came out, and stuff like that really puts things in historical context, because a book like that is still considered a classic today. And you can just imagine Sosonko like holding this book like a treasure and smuggling it to these champions when they leave the country. And he said that he was always giving books to the people that he mentions throughout the champions we'll be discussing the rest of the podcast.
Yeah, which also gives you an insight of of the era. Like, can you imagine not being able to buy certain books because they are banned?
Yeah, and part of my love for Sosonko is just I just have so much respect for him having the courage to leave everything he knew and to feel like he had. And this probably comes through when I interview people who've emigrated to different places, chess players. I mean, just to feel so strongly about needing different circumstances, whether it be politically, economically, or just personally motivated to strike out somewhere brand new. I mean, I just have so much respect for that. And in that case in particular, because there was it was such an act of bravery.
Yeah. I think that in one of the books, I think in the book, now we are maybe slightly off the tangent, but in one of the books about Korchnoi, I believe, because where he describes how Korchnoi emigrated, he also went on to describe how he emigrated. And there's a story that he had to report to the local chess club or the place where he worked beforehand. Uh, that he is going to leave, or that I think that he even announced that he was going to leave, and then there was this whole committee of people, basically bashing him and calling him traitor or close to that, and then he had to endure it with a smiley face, because if any one of them provided a formal complaint, then he would be banned from going abroad and everything would be in vain. So it was like that serious, and another reason why everybody was so careful not to say anything to upset the authorities, apart from Botvinnik, but we would get to that later.
Right.
Yeah.
And just to bring it back to Smyslov and just add a little more color. I mean, Smyslov, famous for, in addition to being an amazing chess player, having a great singing voice and loving to sing. Sosonko says you didn't have to ask him twice to sing. He describes obsession at different times. He was the kind of person, which I think is not uncommon in the chess world, where in addition to getting obsessed with chess, you might become obsessed with another topic. So he mentions that Smyslov had like a period where he was reading all about UFOs and talking about UFOs constantly. The same with what happens after you die. So just very, he paints a portrait of a pretty interesting character, even away from the chessboard.
Yeah, and somewhat nutty to an extent, because it was not only about UFO. He believed in afterlife and all sorts of mysteries, aliens, and other conspiracy stuff. Yeah, and as for singing, it has to be said that he considered at some point even to go professional, and that he did sing in the Bolshoi Theater, which is, I think, a famous venue in Russia, or in St. Petersburg. So he was no slouch, definitely. Although it's not uncommon for chess players to have a huge talent in music as well.
Right. Although singing, it doesn't. That's I feel like playing an instrument. There's, if you have the pattern recognition, you have the pattern recognition. But singing, you actually need a good voice too.
Yeah, I agree. It's a bit more difficult.
So I've got one more quote I'd like to read. This is from his later years. So Smyslov lived to be 89, and towards the end, I believe he said to Genna, one day, Genna, when I became world champion, I got the feeling that the whole world had risen up against me. This didn't help me to have a peaceful life or a relaxed mindset. Perhaps that's why I lost the return match with Botvinnik, and not only because I was seriously ill during the match, or perhaps I felt the internal discomfort because I was ill. Do I regret anything? Yes, I do.
Profound.
Yeah, I mean, it's quotes like that you can't really get. I mean, if they didn't write a memoir, you can't really get stuff like that from many other sources. So, I mean, that really really gives you a sense of
uniqueness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else on Smyslov?
Oh, if I can just one brief quote, I can include one brief quote. So I liked his view on the computer engines. So I have a quote that states that computers have come into chess for good and have brought a lot of analytical clarity to it, but they've also destroyed the spirit of the game, the clash of personalities.
Yeah. I had highlighted that quote too. It's an evergreen quote. People might agree with it or they might not, but they've been saying it since Smyslov, so it obviously holds true for some people.
But I have to say, he obviously never made a Twitter account, else he would have not said that chess lacks personalities.
Yeah, and he didn't meet AlphaZero, I mean...
Yeah, that's also true.
The chess computers have taken an interesting turn of late, although some might still make the same arguments, but yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. So who was next, Vjeko, for you?
Well, how do you want to do? Do I need to go down my list, or do you want to say who was your third?
It'll get too confusing if we go to mine. So just go to your fourth, and then I'll.
Okay, so my next one was Euwe or Euwe or whatever he's pronounced. I'm horrible with Dutch names.
I'm obviously not the person to ask, although I did find one online source who suggested Euwe. Although I'm sure there are any Dutch listeners cringing right now, but anyway, 5th world champion, Dutch hero, later FIDE president. My impression of him from reading about him has been he always seems like the sanest world champion to me. Like you don't read anything crazy about him. I mean, I guess you could maybe make that argument for someone like Spassky as well, but he just kind of seemed to have his shit together. And I mean, obviously, even if he's not considered one of the best players of all time, obviously an incredible player. What were you going to say, Vjeko?
Yeah, I just want to say he was very, very correct and very principled, very scientific and, very, very stubborn. And, he had certain sense of justice, which is not very common for chess players, I would say, or world champions.
Yeah, and there was one quote from Sosonko that maybe possibly framed my my impression of Euwe. Although again, I had that impression even before having read this book. Here's a quote about Euwe. He says, "The idea of spending forever demonstrating his chess superiority and pushing all other aspects of life into the background was completely uninviting to him. He had none of the qualities or perhaps shortcomings necessary for a lengthy reign as world champion. Among the geniuses and philosophers, fanatics, and supermen that can be that can be distinguished easily among the world champions, Max Euwe stands out for his humility, his ordinariness. He leaves one with the impression that what he did could have been done by almost anyone." So, very poetic quote, and of course, it was kind of a shock when he won the world championship. So, it could be, I mean, he wasn't considered like even the number 2 player in the world when he won, was quite unexpected. And he himself, as Sosonko alludes to, didn't seem like he expected to win that match.
Yeah, so it was, I think, we are referring to the 1935 World Championship match where, how did you say, Euwe beat Alekhine, and it was like maybe the biggest surprise in chess, and still is today, I would say, because nobody expected him to win. But I think that it also has something to do with him being the underdog, and I think with Alekhine actually underestimating him. Because there is even a quote in this chapter where taken from Alekhine's own writings that he says that if our contest should end in victory for him, it would only show that at that point I was not on top of my game. So much the worse for me.
Yeah, and of course, Vjeko mentioned earlier that Sosonko mentions Alekhine's drinking issues, and he quotes Euwe speculating that he may have been drunk at the board for a few games in particular within this match. So no one knows for sure, but certainly Alekhine did not bring his A game.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to discuss like the return match, because 2 years after, Euwe was the one who was considered the favorite, and then he lost that match. And that may have something to do with the fact that, as you said, that he didn't have this killer instinct and utter willingness to devote his life to chess. Because there is also a quote that says that the main reason for Euwe's loss of the second match was probably his attitude. Well, I've got the World Championships title. I fulfilled the hopes of those who believed in me and helped me.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a few more quotes I'd like to share about Euwe. There were some really good ones. So one of them is just Sosonko talking about sort of the impact he had in his life. So he says, "In the summer of 1972, I departed the Soviet Union, my luggage consisting entirely of a strong desire to leave the country, a rather sketchy impression of the world that lay beyond its borders, and a suitcase full of books. According to the rules, I was allowed to carry out only books printed in the country after 1945. Books printed before that date required special permission. Overcoming the obstacles thrown up by the bureaucracy, I obtained the desired stamp from the Ministry of Culture, permission to remove from the USSR for a book printed in 1936. This was a chess book. I had used it more than once to give children lessons in the Leningrad Palace of Pioneers, where I'd worked as a trainer. To this day, I consider it one of the best chess books ever. I still have it. The title reads Max Euwe, Chess Lessons. Little could I imagine then that within a few months of my leaving, I would be speaking to the author, meeting him frequently, and even playing him in a short match."
Yeah, that's an amazing quote.
Yeah, and this one in particular, I mean, it shows that he was just a daily force in his life. I mean, Sosonko ended up living, I mean, I believe he still does, lives in Amsterdam, and Euwe would often be in his office, and Sosonko would just stop in and see him frequently. So it really is amazing. I mean, to imagine reading a book like that growing up and feeling like you're just on, I mean, in the Soviet Union, as compared to the Netherlands, was like being in a different planet. And then you end up just spending so much time and playing with this legend of the chessboard.
Yeah, I think that he definitely played a big role in in Sosonko's life, but also in Korchnoi's life a few years later, because I think it's not coincidence that Korchnoi emigrated to Netherlands.
Yeah, he Sosonko mentions that he had conversations with Korchnoi, and that Korchnoi then he helped facilitate conversations between Euwe and Korchnoi, because Korchnoi was in the middle of the candidate cycle and was considering emigrating. But one of the many concerns that he had was, would he be able to retain whatever place he had in the candidate cycle if he was switching countries in the middle of it. And Euwe, as Sosonko tells it, was extremely helpful with that and assured him that there wouldn't be any issues.
Yeah, so it has to be perhaps emphasized that after his career, he became the FIDE president, and that's why he had this authority to deal with such a decisions. And actually, you have to admire Euwe, because you can imagine the pressure he faced from the Soviets at that time, at the height of the Cold War, and he insisted in defending Korchnoi's rights and allowing him to play in the candidates. I think it really angered the Soviets. Although Sosonko does mention that in retrospective, even I think Yuri Averbach mentioned that Euwe was the best FIDE president ever.
Yeah, which yeah, I mean, just to be mentioned in that obviously means that he, didn't mess anything up too badly, which is basically the standard by which we judge these things. So anything else on Euwe before we keep it moving, Vjeko?
Well, if I may I complain about him as well, or
yeah.
Okay. So I mean, one thing that really surprised me about him, or that was really profound to me, was that even though it was mentioned that he didn't want to devote his life to chess, he basically devoted his life to work. So there are many passages in the book where Sosonko writes how Euwe, he couldn't stop working at any moment. He was working on trains, he was working at home, and he had this very strict routine. And from all these passages, not to quote them all now, I kind of get the feeling that he didn't really know how to enjoy life, that he maybe used his work to escape from something or someone. And I mean, I can maybe relate to that because I have the same tendencies. But there's like this passage where he talks about, he writes how he never, even though he loved music, he never visited the concerts, and music was something of lesser importance than his work. So I don't know, that was just profound to me, and I kind of felt that this was not at least for me, it's not the most healthy life policy, but okay.
Are you just throwing that in to impress our Chessable employed listeners, since you're doing some work for Chessable, Vjeko?
Well, considering that half of the Chessable is Dutch and I just butchered the Dutch name, I think that ship has long sailed. But okay, maybe I can score some bonus points.
Oh, I mean, if the Dutch weren't understanding if they were judgmental about mispronunciations, they would have stopped coming on my show long ago. So I think you're okay in that regard. But just as a brief aside, just because I meant to ask you this personally, so are you working full time for Chessable now, Vjeko, or?
Well, not yet. I'm actually in the middle of transitioning them. I'm kind of part-time, but actually just in the process of trying to figure everything out and quit my job to join their full-time.
Excellent. It's awesome to see them hiring so many chess players in addition to their full-time employees, people like Todd Bryan and Mike Zelazny also getting work. Shout out to those friends of the pod. But let's bring it back to the book review.
Yeah.
So who's next?
On my list, it's your guy that's way down on your list. That's Mikhail Botvinnik.
Well, to be fair, I had numbers, as we've said, numbers 3 through 6 very close together. So, but I did enjoy the Botvinnik chapter. What did you think about it, Vjeko?
Yeah, I think it was fascinating because I was really I had a very negative opinion on Botvinnik in general. I recently read the book translated by Douglas Griffin, I believe, Levenfish, the Soviet Outcast. So Levenfish was an older generation of player preceding Botvinnik who kind of, in his later life, he got, let's say, blocked by Botvinnik, and Botvinnik really benefited from the Soviet system in his early career. He enjoyed a lot of privileges of the champion, and I kind of wasn't very fond of him previously. But after reading Sosonko's accounts on him, I kind of changed my mind and realized that nothing in his life is black and white, and that he was a very, very complex and double-edged character, so to speak.
Yeah, I think in those Soviet times, I mean, it must have been especially hard for anyone to just be one thing, because you have to have a certain, I mean, unless you're just like outright anti-government, you have to maintain certain appearances. So it really takes a personal recollection like this to know where someone really stands. And, often we make sacrifices for our careers that may not necessarily jibe with our personal views. So Botvinnik certainly isn't the only person to have faced issues like that, and obviously faced them on a bigger scale than a lot of us do. Just to give a little more sort of background info on Botvinnik, sixth world champion. He was also a practicing electrical engineer and computer scientist, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about his interest in chess and computers in a little bit later. But yeah, this one I didn't feel like was as personal as some of the other chapters.
Yeah, maybe because Sosonko, I think he didn't quite know Botvinnik as much as some other players. And on the other hand, it's also debatable whether it was possible to be too personal with Botvinnik anyway, since he was kind of, closed and very, very strict character, I would say. Harder to breach and to be forced to talk as openly as maybe some other players. That's at least my impression, which may be wrong.
Yeah, that's mine as well. I mean, and I didn't have as many quotes highlighted about Botvinnik as compared to some of the others. I mean, he as you mentioned, he was complex in the sense that he generally was trying to advance his career at whatever cost, but he also tells the story of him refusing, I mean, a well-known story of refusing to sign a letter attacking Korchnoi for defecting, and said it wasn't a habit of mine to sign letters that expressed other people's thoughts. He tells the story of so Sosonko, of course, was persona non grata, which was the name of the Korchnoi book that we were trying to remember earlier, right?
Yeah.
It just occurred to me as saying it, but Sosonko also was persona non grata in the Soviet Union after defecting, and he also tells the story of them discussing it. Like Botvinnik was giving a talk at a chess club, and someone asked about a game that Sosonko had recently played. And of course, the person that asked tried to sort of dance around saying his name because he was so vilified in the Soviet Union that they wouldn't want to say his name. But Botvinnik said his name and said he's not gonna pretend like he doesn't know who it is or dance around who his name was. So
yeah, I think the exact quote was, "Do you think I'm afraid to say the name Sosonko?"
Very good. Yes.
Yeah, and that's the reason. These types of stories are the reason why I really like this chapter. I mean, I'm in general fond of this, let's say, political / historical conversations or moments or events, and stories like this completely changed my opinion about Botvinnik, because even though in his early days he was like kind of the model Soviet citizen, in the later years, I imagine he did a lot to anger the Soviet authorities by doing stuff like this. And I think that there is even a quote in the book that says that KGB had a quite big file on the Botvinnik case. And actually, I think in the later stage of his life, he was forbidden from traveling abroad, which was always let's say measure how friendly with the authorities you are or not. So I wasn't expecting that he would be so rebellious later in age. I wasn't familiar with that aspect, and that was fascinating to me.
Yeah, and it looks like you've got a couple more notes here on Botvinnik, Vjeko. So if you don't mind, I just is there anything else? I feel like we should give a little more shine to this legendary player.
Yeah, I generally have a lot of these stories where he defies the authorities, but maybe the quote that is most vivid is that actually talks about Botvinnik's character. So can I read it, or do you want to have the honor?
No, go ahead. Go for it.
So Botvinnik had a complex character. He could be harsh, he could be arrogant, he could be cold, but he could also be a loyal friend. He never compromised his principles or backed down on his beliefs. There are many stories about his idiosyncratic behavior. Once he refused to play in an international tournament, announcing that he hadn't received an official invitation. When a functionary from the Soviet Chess Federation tried to dispute this, saying that he had sent an invitation to Botvinnik as he had to all the other grandmasters, a brief retort followed. I am not all of them. I am Botvinnik.
Yeah, that there's a lot in there. I don't.
Yeah. I think that this captures who he was most vividly and most precisely.
Yeah, and of course, for listeners interested in the chess, obviously, well worth a deep dive into Botvinnik's games. But in terms of the person, I mean, maybe it's because he was complex. That I mean, of course, everyone's complex, but I didn't. I still, I don't know. I felt like I don't have a clear picture. Like you read the Tal chapter, and it's like you feel Tal. You know, you know what he's like. Maybe that's just because he's so much larger than life. But I didn't necessarily feel that way about Botvinnik.
Yeah, I don't dispute that fact that there was very little personal, but for some reason it didn't bother me because these sorts of stories and were sufficient to keep my interest in this chapter in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then to wrap it up on Botvinnik, I mean, then he talks about in his later years how he was just obsessed with chess computers. And unfortunately, I don't think I had the quote. I don't know if you did, but he had one where he talked about how he didn't feel like, and of course, obviously he knew the field of computers more so than most. He didn't feel like computers were necessarily just going to be playing by rote, sort of foreseeing the way that engines are able to play now, that he thought that they really might someday have a creative chess style, and he certainly saw coming more than others the potential that computers had in chess.
Yeah, I don't have the exact quote, but I do recall mentioning that the Sosonko mentioning that he didn't believe in this sort of brute force approach, and that he was. I'm not sure if he kind of hinted at neural networks or something like that, but he definitely kind of envisioned that AlphaZero will appear one day. So you could say that he was ahead of his time in that regard.
With but two world champions left to discuss, next up is Tigran Petrosian, of course, born in Georgia to Armenian parents. Became world champion in 1963, was it, Vjeko?
I think so, yes, 1963. And defended his title in 1966 against Spassky.
Yeah, and of course, legendary especially as a defensive player, just known for squeezing people and for playing just incredible at never giving an inch, and underrated possibly as a chess player. I mean, a lot of people have them in their top 10 chess players of all time, and an interesting character on top of that, especially as it relates to his biography and what he overcame to become a champion.
Yeah, unfortunately, the fact that he's underestimated has something to do, or I think a lot to do with his style, because whenever you bring up discussion about the greatest player ever, somebody will always throw Tal in, even though Petrosian's achievements were maybe, or he did reign longer as a world champion, among other things. But his style he has a reputation of being very solid and prophylactic. Although I'm not sure that is necessarily the most accurate assessment of his style. I think that Spassky, after their 1966 match, which was like Peterson was actually outplaying him tactically, and Spassky, I think, said that he regarded him first and foremost as stupendous tactician, which is an interesting observation in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, and also I think Sosonko's talked somewhere in the book about his ability to see tactics when his opponents were threatening them, so yeah. It's like it's there, the tactical vision is there within him, but for some reason he was better known at preventing his opponent's tactics than in having them himself.
And actually, if I may interject, I think that it's interesting because Sosonko connects his style with his conditions and with his environment in which he was growing up. So his parents died when he was very, very young. I'm not sure about the exact age, but I think he was still in school. And so both his parents died, and I think he grew up in poverty, and he worked as a street sweeper in his very young age. So and then he worked during the day, and in the evening he would go and play chess. So can you imagine like some child prodigy today sweeping the streets in the morning and then playing chess in the evening and becoming a world champion?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I mean, and he describes feelings of embarrassment at being a street sweeper, how he didn't mind it when there weren't a lot of people around, but around the time like schools let out and businesses were letting out, he would feel a sense of embarrassment that he was doing that. So, yeah, it's really poetic the way Sosonko sort of ties that sense of insecurity to the defense first style of his chess play.
Yeah, and it also tells you about the level of competition and the conditions in the Soviet era and how many strong players there were. Because there's a story about Peterson's childhood friend, the Georgian master Tengiz Gorgatse, who said that already in his youth, Tigran always would count how many points he needed before every tournament so that he would, either qualify for the next stage or win a prize. There's even a very nice story somewhere how Peterson said that, after a win, you should always make a draw, to rest on your rowers and to recuperate your strength. And then somebody who was listening to that conversation said, but hey, Tigran, I think it was Kotov, said, but hey, Tigran, you even make a draw after a draw.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And he's got some really good quotes. I mean, more so than his other players. He talks about his playing style, which again, also I think with Tal, like the people that he knew the best, he was sort of the most expansive about. So here's one quote. There's a few that I'd like to share, but one is, burrow beneath your enemy, undermine his power from within, destroy his economy, his morale, feed him false information, try to crush him, and if possible, don't come out into the open battle. Sun Tzu wrote 2,500 years ago. That was Petrosian style. Safety first was written on his army's standards. And then he goes on to say things like he instantly grasped the essence of a position, found the main melody in it. That's why he was such a great blitz player. There was no time in it for doubt or soul searching.
Yeah. I think that there is some quote that not directly correlated to the book that says where Peterson said that when there were discussions about Kasparov being an unlimited match, or maybe Fischer Karpov, he said that it is a nonsense because some 20 years ago you would have to play 4 months before you would win 6 games against him or something like that. So yeah, he was really, really very cautious, and you could sense dangers 2 steps away, as
yeah, and it sort of carried over to his approach, his professional approach to chess. He took it very seriously. There are no reports of him not reading chess books. And in the 6 years that he was the world champion, he said he had no alcohol or cigarettes. Obviously, that can be contrasted with what Sosonko writes about Tal. So just really appreciated, again, with where he came from, really appreciated the life that he was able to lead as he ascended to the greatest title.
Yeah. And I mean, I think he was very pragmatic and adept at navigating the Soviet hierarchy and society, even more so than, let's say, Botvinnik or Smyslov, in particular Smyslov. So he was just always, calculating, always considering the danger 2 steps ahead, not only in chess but also in life. Because I think that Sosonko writes that when he was with Petrosian, he felt this much more sharply, that he's talking as an immigrant, that he's talking to a Soviet player. So
yeah, although again, to show that there's contrast with everyone, he does. Sosonko also tells the story of by the time the Fischer Spassky match came around, Petrosian was rooting for Fischer, which Sosonko says because he felt like in order for Soviet players to be treated relatively equally, Spassky needed to be taken down a peg, basically.
Yeah. I think he was like he lived the philosophy of my enemy's misery.
Yeah.
My enemy's misery is my luck. Or I wanted to translate it from Croatian, but I failed.
My enemy's enemy is my friend. Yeah.
That's another version of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and he talks about his influential wife, Rona, who planned everything. And he was the one who was also interested in Geller. The wife was also interested in Geller. Is that right? Am I?
Yeah, I think there's like there's a passage where Sosonko writes that she basically had to choose between the two, and she chose Petrosian.
Yeah, she said, "Whoever wins this tournament."
yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
She was also pragmatic. I also liked, there's a very funny quote about her, because so there at some point Peterson managed to get to substitute his small 30 square meter room for a fancy apartment. And then once again, Kotov, for some reason, his name keeps appearing, said that Peterson knows how to exchange bishops for knights, but his wife exchanges everything else.
Good line. And of course, he says when he came to Yerevan, it was a national event. I mean, the chess history of Armenia is, well known, and he's obviously one of the most famous of the champions. So
it was really surprising to read the kind of reception he received. Like he was a national holiday almost of a sort. He was like a real celebrity back in the day.
Yeah, and of course Tal is described in similar ways, and because we're not unexpectedly, being that we both love all of Sosonko's quotes, being that we're running a bit long, I feel like maybe we should move on to Tal. Is there anything else we should add about Petrosian before we do so?
But just one small quote. I'm sorry, I keep waiting.
Oh no!
This. Yeah, but
no need to apologize.
Yeah, he said that there is one part where he talks about the match of Botvinnik, and he basically said that 3 weeks before the match, Petrosian went skiing and didn't look at chess at all. And it was like really amazing to me to listen to that, because can you imagine not looking at chess for 3 weeks before a world championship match today? Like the whole theory of one variation would change in that period.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, just crazy to think about, although certainly things weren't moving as fast then, but still, I mean, someone like Magnus, I mean, he is well known for taking his breaks to play sports and stuff, but it's hard to imagine him just relaxing 3 weeks before a world championship, 3 weeks straight.
Yeah, although Magnus, if you want to make a 3 weeks break before a next world championship match and are looking for an opening, there's a good modern defense course out there.
He probably, Magnus probably has the whole Chessable catalog at his fingertips. So I'm sure he's already studied it, Vjeko.
Yeah, of course. That was the first thing he considered.
Okay, and last but not least, we arrive at the main event. I mean, I don't know what I would like to do, Vjeko, for Mikhail Tal, and of course, I also mentioned Sosonko's memorable writing when Sam Copeland and I discussed the life and games of Mikhail Tal. But what I'd like to do is just read the whole chapter. But
yeah.
But I mean, it's the longest chapter by far, and
I mean, it is not coincidence that Tal is on the front page of the book, if I'm not mistaken, and that also that in the Amazon description of the book, his name is the first to pop up. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we talked about how the early chapters sort of felt like filler. I wonder if he considered the approach of, instead of doing the world champions I knew, doing another sort of monography of Tal, because I feel like there might have been even more there that he could have shared about Tal and expanded that into a book instead of adding a few more world champions who we didn't really know.
Yeah, well, you'll have to invite him to the podcast once again and ask him to explain himself. There's no other way we will ever find out, I guess.
Yeah, well, Genna, you're always welcome. So he's got my email address. I mean, it would be amazing to talk to him again. I do feel like I found his interview to be incredibly insightful, and I thought that his English was great. But I think he was tired by the end of the interview, but I mean, certainly I would love to get to pick his brain and hear some stories again if an opportunity ever presented itself.
Sure, it was one of my favorite episodes as well.
Yeah, it's just a dream. So much we could say about what he shares about Tal. I mean, he talks a lot about his personality. He's got a lot of great quotes from Jan Timman. I mean, I selected like 20 quotes, which is obviously too many to read them all, but I'll start with a couple of the shorter ones. I mean, a genius of improvisation who loved the playing process most of all in chess. What else could we say about his discussion of Mikhail Tal?
Well, I'd like to build up on this, playing or his love for the game. I think that there's a lot we will talk about Tao, his personality, his character traits, his addiction problems. But I think at the core of it all, there was always chess. Chess was what he lived and what he breathed, and all the other things were side effects. That was my impression. Because there's this story where he is basically on his deathbed in a hospital, and then he goes to play a blitz tournament and beats Kasparov and takes up third place among many grandmasters. So that's like the Tao at its core, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's true. And lived a shorter life than a lot of world champions, which I think we'll be sharing some quotes about. The 8th world champion, by the way, of course, from Latvia, and well known for his incredible tactical, sacrificial, and sort of psychological style. I mean, he just brought the fire, and similar to what Sosonko was saying about Petrosian, in that they sort of lived in the way that they played, Tal was the same way. Smoking, drinking, not sleeping, just a sheer life force that is what makes it so fun to read about.
Yeah, he was like, as they say, the candle that burnt on both sides. I think that was Kasparov's description, and that can be really felt in this chapter.
Yeah, and here's
yeah, I don't know where to start as well.
Yeah, and the quotes are so long because even when I was selecting them, it's like, oh, I don't want to leave out that part.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but here's one that sort of sets the scene. So he says, in the spring of 1968, I came to Riga for the first time and spent a whole month with him. We worked on the opening, of course, but it wasn't opening knowledge that was the foundation of successes. It wasn't about the opening, and it's no accident that there's no tall system and no variation named after him in chess. So it was really just about the creativity and the pressure that he put on people. Another quote, danger is risky for others, but not for me. This is from Tal. And if my attacks aren't completely determined by the requirements of the position, so much the worse for those requirements. This was written on his coat of arms. His combinations were so natural that it seemed they flowed out of him out of their own accord and didn't take any work. And then he says, these suggestive lines weren't taken from a characterization of Tal's work. They're from early 19th century reviews of the poems of the young Pushkin. So again, brings in all these outside forces to poetically describe these chess players. And then he says, into the stagnant bog of long maneuvering leapt a young man who voluntarily doubled his pawns on the 5th move so as to open lines for an attack. When the young count from the fairy tale by the brothers Grimm had to sing a mass that he didn't know a single word of, two doves sat on his shoulders and told him the right words. When Tal played Botvinnik, there was still a lot that he didn't know about chess, but somehow he played the right moves.
Yeah, or the most problematic moves for Botvinnik.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, more to the point.
Yeah, although I mean, there's a common impression that he was sort of a gambler. I would say, like almost in his youth. But there is a quote somewhere that he says that he actually spent a lot of time in his youth analyzing the game, and that he studied all the classics. He was basically non-stop working on his chess before rising to fame. So going back to the Capablanca chapter, all these stories of natural-born genius, I kind of highly doubt them, because I think that at some point you had to put some time into the game, and Tal was no exception.
Yeah, with Tal, he describes him staying up for days at a time. Eventually he would become known for other kinds of benders, but I mean, he had that sort of addictive personality where when in his younger years, before he could get himself into trouble, it was chess benders keeping him up.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, this book I think was kind of notable because, I mean, there's a lot of sort of vivid personal recollections. But Sosonko, as far as I know, I mean, the Tal's issues with alcohol were well chronicled. I mean, Sosonko talks about how during certain Olympiads you would just see him at the bar constantly, so anyone who's at that tournament is his reputation is going to be well known. But I believe that his issues with morphine addiction were not as well known until Sosonko brought them to light.
Yeah, although when we are at it, there's a very memorable quote, or that probably displays Tal's jovial attitude even when facing very dark consequences. There is this story that there were rumors about him being addicted to morphine, and at some moment somebody from the newspapers asked him, "Hey Tal, is it true that you are a morphinist?" And then he immediately said, "No, I'm a Chigorinist."
That's pretty funny, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, even when faced with serious issues, he would retort to this sort of, which is kind of symptomatic, because you kind of throughout the chapter you always get the feeling that he was sort of a big child, using these jokes to avoid responsibility, even when appropriate, or maybe when not. So
yeah, and he described his very sort of bohemian lifestyle in Moscow, especially after he won the world championship. I think I've mentioned before the quote that Sosonko writes somewhere about if only in between world championship matches he could have been kept under lock and key, then he might have been able to defend his title. But
I have that one as well, and it was actually
good.
Tal's mother actually said that, which is kind of, you get the feeling where he got his wit from.
Right.
Yeah, just amazingly complex character. And
yeah, he said his life burned. So of course Tal died pretty young. He died at 55, playing chess right up until the end, although he did start to have lots of quick draws. And Sosonko alludes to sort of the hard living catching up with him towards the later years. Although he does mention that he still played a great game against Lautier in Barcelona in 1992. But he says, Sosonko says, Tal's life had burned so intensely that one could confidently consider a month the equivalent of a year.
Yeah. I think there's also a quote where he was, when he visited some tournament or something, he was commenting on some games, and he was like in his 50s, and Sosonko said that he looked much older than he did, and then some fans recognized him, and they basically looked at him as Staunton or Zukertort, and he wrote the miracle wasn't so much that he was alive, but he hadn't died earlier. And replying to a greeting from an acquaintance, he said, "Thank you for what? For recognizing me."
Yeah, which is a tinge of sadness, of course, to that quote, but
yeah, I mean that this is like typical emotional roller coaster you experience throughout this entire chapter, like feeling of sympathy and feeling of sadness at the same time. Like if only he didn't go, or if he didn't do some of those things, he might have still lived much longer. But yeah, then if he didn't do all this stuff, maybe he wouldn't be Tal in the first place.
Yeah. And Sosonko's also got some great quotes from his Dutch compatriot Jan Timman, who, by the way, have you read Timman's Titans, Vjeko?
Yeah, I have just recently finished both this book and Kasparov versus Karpov.
Okay.
About matches. Yeah.
What did you think of those books?
Well, I liked actually even Kasparov and Karpov more, because Timman provided more objective, I think, account than both of these two players. And I read a lot about this match, but actually there was a lot of things that were quite new to me in Timman's account. And I mean, Timman's Titans are also excellent, but they somehow didn't stick to me that much. Even though once again John Hartman was very, very, very. He put a lot of praise for that.
Yeah, I love that book as well. I would, and the reason I mention it is in I'm about to read a quote from Jan Timman, but it just made me think that anyone who ends up reading this book and likes it, if you haven't read Timman's Titans, it's kind of similar. Of course, there's Yasser's Chess Duels, which actually has games in it. I mean, Timman's book has chess in it as well, but sort of, I love that general subgenre where these people who knew these world champions tell what they knew. But so go ahead.
And where there is no pressure to solve some puzzles and improve your game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that'll make me feel bad. Oh, but that reminds me, I have to get this in here, Vjeko. In my intrepid research for you, you have a 2600 bullet rating, because we're about the same FIDE rating. You're like 2180 FIDE. So, but you're
not bullet, blitz.
Blitz. That's even more impressive. Yeah. What's your secret?
Yeah. I have a gaming mouse and I'm fast.
Okay, and
that's basically a lot. And I play the modern defense, which people underestimate, and then they're like, "What the hell is this? Am I allowed to say shit?"
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so they say, "What the hell is this shit?" And then they underestimate it, and then they start thinking about how to refute it, and then they spend time, and then I flag them.
Okay,
that's like 90%.
Okay, but are you playing 3-minute or 5-minute?
I'm mostly 3-minute, but I do play some rapid and classical chess as well, and I have surprisingly decent ratings there. But battle with cheaters, that's a separate topic.
Right.
But the amount that I just played like one rapid game and one classical game like a week ago, and the first game I played after a long time was against Cheater, and then I gave it up again.
Yeah.
Until.
Well, you got to give me some blitz lessons, man, because I am nowhere near that rating, and I'm trying to work on my blitz now, but I'm not naturally fast anymore.
Okay, you want first lesson, get divorced.
All right, hold on. I'm gonna go talk to my wife. No, okay, just kidding. All right, so let's bring it back to this Timon quote. Thank you, listeners who are still with us. So Jan Timon says, of course, he played Tal many times, and then he says, having created pressure on the board, he radiated some kind of field around himself. He allowed himself a level of risk that exceeded all acceptable standards, especially at the beginning of his career. In his game with Keller, for example, from the Zurich 1959 tournament, he could have calmly played for a positional advantage in the opening, and a significant one too. Instead of that, he undertook a piece sacrifice that seemed incorrect, but such incandescence was created on the board. At some point, all of White's pieces were hanging that his opponent couldn't withstand the tension. That was an unbelievable game. And to play like that, you have to have something that I can't express in words. Why, oh, why did he play that way?
Yeah, that sounds like typical Tal.
Yeah.
I mean, it is often said that he didn't calculate the variations, but that he rather saw through them, which is an amazing.
And I did call up that Keller game and play through it, and it was the sort of game where you take one look at it, at least for me, and you're like, all right, well, if I don't spend 5 hours looking at this, I might as well not even look, because I have no clue what's going on in this position. So I wonder if hopefully some grandmaster probably has done a nice YouTube video explaining it, and I'll have to take a look for that. But I mean, he's got so many games like that.
So there is actually an interesting change in his style as he kind of grew older. So there is this famous streak of undefeated games, I think in the 70s or something. And I was surprised how once again Sosonko connected this change of style to the events happening off the board, because somewhere around that time, the authorities started looking, wrongly about Tal, being drinking and not being model citizen. And at some point, he sold his soul, so to speak, and went on to work for Karpov. And he was a member of Karpov's team. And Sosonko speculates that he kind of picked up parts of Karpov's pragmatic style along the way, because it was the most important thing for him was, to live freely, to travel abroad, to enjoy life, and he couldn't stay in Soviet Union for long. Traveling to international competitions was like a must for him. So it was an interesting observation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, and he's got so many little anecdotes. I mean, he obviously lived it up when he traveled. He tells a story about Steve Doyle, former USCF president, like going gambling with Tal in Atlantic City, and Tal just losing everything. He generally talks about him being hopeless with daily chores and with money. Here's a quote from GM Alexei Sweeten, who says, like all to whom fate is kind, Tal was subject to egocentrism. So, I mean, really just the world seems like it really literally revolved around him.
Yeah, that's what actually his girlfriends say. So there is a quote. Okay, I'm just trying to find it, but basically that every girlfriend who was ever with him complained that it was all about him, that they need to sort everything for him, do this boring bureaucratic stuff. And I think at some point Boleslavsky was asked before the match with Botvinnik whether Koblenz, Tal's second, asked Boleslavsky if he wants to become a coach, and Boleslavsky said already back then that Tal doesn't need a coach, he needs a nanny.
Yeah. Just amazing quote. And Sosonko with another sort of misdirection quote where he calls in something from another realm, another Russian literature realm. In this case, he quotes Tolstoy's wife saying, this is the legendary author Lev Tolstoy, of course. I lived with him for 48 years and never found out what type of person he was. And then Sosonko says Misha was similar, brilliant, excuse me, brilliant, inexplicable, incredible, an angel and a demon simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much layers to his character. I mean, whether we are talking about the alcoholism or I mean, on the other side, we had this devil may care sort of bohemic lifestyle. On the other hand, we had chess. On the third hand, we had a profound intellectual that read voraciously. The Sosonko writes that the speed of Tal's reading was legendary, that he was able to read a book in one day. He also knew how to play the piano. So I mean, there's so much aspects about Tal that are revealed in this book that it's incredible.
Yeah, and despite having 3 fingers, it should be said, was able to play the piano.
Yeah. So he played. I think he played Chopin's Etudes, which I'm not sure how familiar people are with pianos literature, but that's fairly advanced material, like very serious. It's not like some basic elementary stuff. It's really high level of piano playing. So
yeah. And I've only got believe it or not, a couple more quotes, but one that I saw that we both had selected, Vjeko, again, reflecting on his later years. He says, when he was young, he had managed to give to Bacchus what was Bacchus's and to Kaisa what was Kaisa's, and the gods of chess had closed their eyes to his mischief, but the 50-year-old Tal could no longer get away with it. And how good your Greek mythology? Did you know what the Bacchus reference was, or how were you able to deconstruct that one, Vjeko?
I kind of knew that it's a god of wine. I have a knack for this.
I just knew the word bacchanalia, like wild party, and then had to look it up from there. But I got the context right away.
Yeah, I'd recommend Stephen Fry's Mythos to anybody interested into this. So this is a Greek mythology through fun stories, basically. So.
Stephen Fry, what's it called?
Mythos.
Okay. Well, yeah, sounds good to me. I do love Greek mythology. I just it's been a long time since I've read about it, so I need a refresher.
Although I'm not now that from the top of my head, I'm not sure if Bacchus is Roman or Greek. Maybe even Roman, but maybe I'm embarrassing myself.
Okay, yeah. Now we're getting way too far afield.
Yeah, I agree.
It's all my fault. So. What is there anything else we should add? I mean, I just feel like we could trade quotes for hours, and you just have to the Tal quote, the Tal section itself is well worth the $10 on Kindle, and it's probably like 35-40% of the book, right? I mean, it's much longer than the other chapters.
Yeah, I think even around 40%. I was kind of keeping track on the Kindle. I think it's definitely a third or more.
Yeah, which is fantastic because the whole thing is riveting.
Yeah, and it's impossible to like convey it without reading it. We can just give a snippet, I think.
Yeah. So anything else on Tal before we just kind of wrap up our overall view?
Yeah, perhaps we can wrap it up with the final quote of the chapter, which says that many people live a double and even a triple life, which is why it's hard to portray anyone in words. To revive them on paper, it's a hopeless task, especially someone like Tal. Under this name, a very complicated conglomerate structure was concentrated in each facet of which there was so much of everything.
Yeah, which is why he's endlessly fascinating. I mean, I so many chess books I want to talk about on this podcast, and I've already done one on Tal, and here we are talking about Tal again. That pretty much says it all.
Although I think from slightly different angle, because
for sure,
much darker one, I would say. Which is also very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we've been talking about the contrast amongst all the players. It is darker, but you also feel the life force, So there was a sadness in terms of his addictions, but it sounds like mostly he would be fun to hang out with.
Yeah, for sure.
So to summarize, so we're going to let you go in a few minutes, Vjeko. But overall, is there anything to be said about the book that we haven't said, or just to sort of synthesize what we've already mentioned? How many stars are you giving The World Champions I Knew?
On a scale to 5 or to 10?
Let's say 5. We'll keep it on the Amazon scale.
I would say 4. If you like these books and you are into chess stories and chess histories, and if you're not, maybe 3 then.
Yeah,
it's highly subjective. But like, if in comparison to other Sosonko's books, I wouldn't maybe recommend it first. But as a standalone book, I wouldn't say that you would regret paying for it.
Yeah, I agree, and it's the sort of thing where I would give certain chapters 5 and other chapters 2.5 or 3. Obviously, the later chapters, Tal and Petrosian, and the Soviet era players that he knew being the strongest material. But overall, that stuff is so good that it's well worth it. And the other stuff, you do learn things about the champions. So,
I mean, it has to be mentioned that the book doesn't have a single 1-star or 2-star reviews on Amazon, which is already a significant feat in the modern day.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, and Vjeko, you are yet another generous soul who volunteered to make a donation in lieu of receiving any compensation for this podcast. And I had made a suggestion that there's this guy Tunde. You just said you didn't know where to send the money, and there's this guy Tunde Onokoya, who is a chess teacher in Nigeria, who had a thread on Twitter that went viral, sort of telling the story of introducing chess to these kids in the slums in Nigeria. And he showed a picture of a little girl that he introduced to chess, and that he's using it as a vehicle to uplift people, basically. So I think it's a great cause. And Vjeko, you okay with sending a small donation to the Chess in the Slums program initiative in Nigeria?
Yeah, sure. I think kudos to you for pointing it out, because I have to say I wasn't quite familiar with chess non-profits organizations. So
yeah, I mean, there's always. Sorry, go ahead.
And this one is particularly noble, and I liked the cause very much, and would definitely recommend everybody to check it out and contribute if they are able.
Yeah, and Tunde is a good follow on Twitter. I mean, he's really out there trying to generate, notice for what he's doing, and of course raise funds. And pretty strong player. I mean, he's close to 2,200 FIDE, so the kids are in good hands.
Yeah, very inspiring stuff.
Yeah, it's great. So I do have some blindfold puzzles for you guys who are still listening, but Vjeko, I think we can say goodbye before I read those.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you so much for your help. I mean, your enthusiasm and knowledge of chess is quite evident throughout. So I really appreciate it, Vjeko. And you're one of the many people who I've corresponded with a lot online. So it was nice to finally hear your voice.
Yeah, it's likewise. It was my honor to be here, and I hope I didn't monopolize the conversation too much. I have this tendency sometimes, but I was so excited to be here, and it was really immense pleasure to go over this book.
No, you definitely did not. And maybe we'll do another Sosonko book someday if you're up for it and if people request it.
Yeah, sure. Perhaps after you invite him to your podcast and ask him why he hasn't yet written another one. I mean, what am I supposed to read these days?
Right. Yeah, you mentioned something about. So, do you know if he's working on something or not? Do you?
Because no, I have no idea.
Yeah, I hope he is.
I'm not the one who said that he has his email address. I mean, just saying.
Right, that's a good point. I believe he's 77. But as of a year and a half ago when I talked to him, still very sharp. So hopefully he's still grinding away and going to tell a few more stories for us. But
I don't really follow. These people mentioned he has articles published, but I have to be honest, I haven't ever read his article outside of the books, so I'm not even sure where you can find them.
He's definitely had some in New in Chess, although I don't recall any the super recently. So yeah, hopefully that's because he's working on a book, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as expected, there's just so many stories that we've done another long one. But Vjeko, I know it's late where you are, so thank you again, and have a good night.
Yeah, you too, Ben. Thanks once again for inviting me, and looking forward to see what you have in store for us.
Oh yeah, and one. Oh, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, but just one last plug: Chess Central's blog. You're on Twitter, Chessable. Anywhere else we need to shamelessly plug?
No, that I think that's fine.
Okay. All right. Have a good night, Vjeko.
Yeah, you too. And once again, thank you so much.
All right, guys. It is time for the monthly blindfold chess puzzles. I shamelessly stole these puzzles from friend of the show, Say Chess One's Twitter feed, with his permission to be exact. But he's been sharing some cool blindfold puzzles that Say Chess One. So thank you to Martin. And these puzzles, I think, are both what I would call intermediate level. The second one's a little bit harder than the first. It is white to move and find the best continuation. Here is the piece placement. So white has a pawn on h4, a queen on c2, and a king on b1. Once again, that's a pawn on h4, a queen on c2, and a king on b1. Black has pawns on g7 and h5, a king on h7, and a queen on g6. Once again, black has pawns on g7 and h5, a king on h7, and a queen on g6. And once again, as always, if you go to the show description, there'll be a link where you can click to see the position if you need to, as well as prose that describes where the pieces are if you need to look at it again. And then to find out the answer, you can just turn on the engine when you click through to the position. For puzzle number 2, again, white to move, again, intermediate puzzle. This one's probably slightly harder. White has a rook on a1 and a king on d2. Black has pawns on b2 and c2 and a king on b4. And that's all. But to repeat the whole thing, white has a rook on a1 and a king on d2. And black has pawns on b2 and c2, and their king is on b4. White to move, find the best combination. And that's all for this month's Chess Book podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care. Special thanks, as always, to my producer, Matthew Passy, and thanks to those who continue to help spread the word about Perpetual Chess. Positive reviews on podcast platforms and YouTube help people discover the show, as does telling a friend or sharing it on social media. Speaking of which, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at BennyFishel1, or join the Perpetual Chess Facebook group and continue the conversation about the latest interview. But most of all, of course, I want to thank those who provide financial support to the show, especially right now with so much disruption going on in the world. Most of all, I want to thank Chessable for sponsoring the show, and to everyone who kicks in via PayPal or the Perpetual Chess Patreon page to help sustain and improve Perpetual Chess. And without further ado, I would like to give special thanks to the following people and entities: Chessable, Quality Chess Books, the Capital City Chess Club, a Print Chess Twitch channel, Andrew Al-Harjri, Andrew Bach, Austin Clough, Benjamin Porteau, Bill Sigler, Kathy Carr, Chad Oliver, Chris Flanagan, Dan O'Hanlon, Danny Davidson, David Shriver. I am Dimitri Schneider. I am Eric Rosen, Firas Sawaf, Gary Foreman, Greg Nattel, Greg Shahadi, Guven Manet, James Kennedy, Jen Scream, John Jernigan, John Rockefeller, John Cromarty, John MacArthur, Kelly Palmer, Kevin O'Callahan, Lucio Casada Silva, the law offices of Stuart Katz, Michael Kahn, FM Michael Oblin, Mike Zelazny, Moonmaster 9000, you recently stopped your pledge, but Perpetual Chess will always love you. The famous Mr. Dodgy, Peter Zhody, Reuven Fisher, Seattle Chess Club, Thomas Stonix, Thomas Tachenko, Todd Bryan of Strong Chess, Todd Kennedy, and I also would like to thank the following people: Aaron Waffler, Ace Vallega, Adam Ralph of ChessEngland.com, Adrian Gutierrez, Alex Pejas, FM Andre Terakov, Dr. Andrew Perry, Aniti Deer, Better Chess Training, Bill Juniper, Bill Moran, Brad and Andy Rosen, Brett Howard Lynn, Brian Mullis, Chad Hilton, Dr. Charles Snodgrass, Chris Wainscott, Christopher Baumgartner, Christopher Chabris, Chris Lott, Christopher Wood. I am Christoph Zalecki, aka Chess Explained, Coach J's Chess Academy, Costa Carras, Courtney Fry, Craig Mallon, Daniel Gell, Daniel Ginsberg, Daniel Lucas of US Chess, Daniel Naylor, Dave Saylor, David Bleskacek, David Cramley of Chessable.com, Dalen Shelton, Dirk Decker, Dwayne Edmonds, Ed Daly, Ethan Smith, Ian Mason, I Am Elect, Donnie Ariel, or possible not I Am Elect, Fox Valley Chess Club, Francis Letarte Lavoie, Frank Tortoris, MD, Gary Andrews, Gary Lewis, Geert Vandervelde, Gerard Barter, Giovanni Russo, Greg Harfst, Han Schut, Harish Srinivasan, Jacob Kovac, Jacques Pari, James Aspinwall, James Benastia, James Murr, Jason Woolham, J.Deep Chakrabarty, Jeff Anderson, Jeffrey Martello, Yep Holland, Jerry Wells, Jim Ratliff, J.J. Schnod, Dr. John Fallon, John Fernandez, John Fontaine, John Hartman, John Jeffrey, John McMurtry, Jonathan Slater, Jordan Goodwin, Jose Rodriguez, Justin Gardner, Jen Shahadi, Joe Rocky, John Thompson, Grandmaster Josh Friedel, I am Kare Christensen, WGM Katerina Nemtsova, Kelly Palmer, I am Kostya Kovyutsky, Krishna Kapala Krishnan, Kyle McAvoy, Larry Ryforth, Laura Belyavsky, Martin Knudsen, Martin Krug, Matthew Passy, Matthew Tedesco of SeattleChessMeetup.org, the Mechanics Institute Chess Club of San Francisco, Michael Allard, Miguel Aristide, Mike Clem, Mr. Mike Shahadi, Mitchell Fabian, Nate Solin, Neil Bruce, Negmat Malajanov, Olaf Mueller-Michaels, GM Pascal Charbonneau, Pasi Passanen, Paul Bain, Paul Clarkson, Paul Sweeney, Paulo Santana, Peter Lux, Randall Temple, Ricky Grijalva, Richard Hollenbuck, Robert Turner, Roy Yearwood, Ryan Berg, the Say Chess YouTube channel, Scott Doherty, Scott McKinnon, Sebastian Finsterwalder, Stefan Roller, WGM Tatyev Abrahamian, Tim Brennan of TacticsTime.com, Tim Seymour, Timothy Ha, Tom Edsel, Tomas Komanich, Tony Rotella, Tyron Price, Vishnu Srikumar, Wayne Beam, William Brock, William Juniper, William Hogarth, William Peterson, FM Zhao Cheng of Chess1000.com, and last but never least, Zhivko Stoyanov. Thanks for listening, everyone. Catch you guys soon.